So my job in this presentation and this session is to sort of take all this great information and the data that Guillaume and Eric have presented and put it in the context of local decision making. Now, if all we cared about was climate change, that would be easy, right? Maybe not easy, but especially in the context of floodplain management, we need to be able to put the climate data in the context of multiple objective planning that these local communities need to deal with more than just the climate impacts. So what I'm going to present is a way that the Nature Conservancy has worked with Snohomish County to try to develop one way. It's just one example of how we can take that information and integrate it with other data sources and other important decisions that are being made in the community. So we are using a tool that the Nature Conservancy has developed called Coastal Resilience. It's an online mapping platform. It was actually one of the apps that was featured in the ESRI presentation the other day. I think it's important, though, to start my talk with the big caveat that even though I'm essentially giving a talk about a tool, it's not about the tool, right? So the tool and the geospatial data that have been developed can't be used or really shouldn't be used to try to be prescriptive in terms of do this right here and answer a decision, but really it's a tool to help catalyze conversations and inform decisions. And what we've really found in this work is that a lot of times it's really simple of putting data on a map side by side, and that is what generates conversation and catalyzes and informs decisions. So that's kind of the general approach we're taking. Fundamentally, the question is, how do you compare the value of a floodplain that looks like this, whether you care about economic value or ecological value, social value, community values, whatever values you have, how do you compare this to a floodplain that looks like this, or a floodplain that looks like this? Because we have all of these in Puget Sound, right? And so the whole concept and the idea behind the Floodplains by Design initiative, in a nutshell, is to simply work with locals to develop the values that they care about in their floodplain, and then work with the state and federal agencies to bring funding to those projects that integrate multiple values in one floodplain. That's the essence of what we're trying to do. The genesis of the Floodplains by Design was really about trying to integrate flood control and salmon recovery projects, because those are happening independently in most of our watersheds. Now we're really trying to bring climate adaptation as another core component of those projects. So as an example, we wanted to talk about our decision support work in Snohomish County. And one of the reasons why it's been so great to work with Snohomish County is that they already have a multi-stakeholder group that could help us through, and we could help them. It was a nice collaboration in terms of they have a multi-stakeholder group called the Sustainable Land Strategy. And I'm sure Debbie will talk about this a lot in the next presentation. But I just wanted to give a little context that this is a group that has been established for more than 3 years now and has been working consistently and diligently to manage their floodplains for multiple benefits. Their goal is explicitly, their mission is explicitly to achieve net gain for both agricultural community and the conservation community in the Snohomish County. So I think it's important to also note that on their executive committee of this group, there is very good representation, both the Stillaguamish and the Tulalip tribes, the conservation districts, and other agricultural parties are active participants, as well as state, federal, and county agencies. So we are sort of latching on to this existing stakeholder body. The work that we're doing is really trying to just provide a systematic and rigorous approach to help inform these multiple objective decisions. So the challenge in the Snohomish is very similar to a lot of the North Sound. When you look at the floodplains, fundamentally the floodplain is predominantly privately owned by farmers, but everything lands here, right? So it's the Snohomish in particular is the second largest estuary next to the Skagit, a little farther north, and it's a huge area for a number of critically endangered salmon species. The Snohomish Basin is actually one of the fastest growing regions in Puget Sound, with 60% growth expected just in the first part of this century. So there's a number of threats and issues, and everything's trying to happen here in the floodplain. There's a critical need for flood control for both the communities and also for the agricultural and the ecological communities here. So the context for me is one important quote that a farmer that we work with in the Skagit has said is that, 100 or 150 years ago when they put in the dikes, they were doing the best thing for agriculture. If they were to do that today, they would do it very differently. And so that comment always sticks in my mind, is that when we look at these decisions, we have to think of the context, is that the sea dikes and the levees aren't necessarily where we would want them, especially for today or looking to the future with climate impacts coming down the river. So this is the online mapping platform, the decision support tool a big team of folks have developed at the Nature Conservancy. And within here, we've developed 2 apps specifically for Snohomish County and the Sustainable Land Strategy. So you'll see on the left side, there are a number of different apps. The 2 I'm gonna talk about today are Flood Level Rise and Integrated Community Planning. So I'm showing an example, just a screenshot right now, of the Integrated Community Planning app. And you can see there's a number of different data sources here. Whether you're interested in regulatory issues, those are the boundaries or infrastructure layers, the levees and the sea dikes. There's fish habitat priority areas, agricultural layers, and then social and economic layers. I want to say that most of this data came from Snohomish County, so this is just a platform for integrating different data sources. It's not data that we've generated. So the thing that I think is interesting about Snohomish and working in the lower Snohomish is there's always a number of different ways to define the floodplain, but actually in the Snohomish, it's pretty easy because it's essentially the whole river basin. So in yellow is your FEMA special flood hazard area, which most of you are probably familiar with. And that essentially is the whole river valley. So the risk is just an extensive area in the Snohomish. I think that's an important context to just keep that in mind. It's the whole river valley. So really what the decision support tool does is help create an integrated vision. It just helps level the playing field and put a number of different data sources on the table. So here's an example where we're just looking at, on the left is your fish habitat, so where are the priority areas for different species. And the middle is where's the biggest flood risk. This is the data that Guillaume just presented. And on the right is a layer that the county has developed in terms of looking at where's your highest priority ag areas, or where's the highest value crop lands within the county. So again, this isn't prescriptive, but we found it's really powerful for leveling the playing field between different interest groups, just to have a map of priority areas and have it side by side. There's really no rocket science in our decision support tools. It's simply a very simple tool for integrating and catalyzing conversations. This is a screenshot from the Flood Level Rise app that we've developed for Snohomish County. Interesting, I'm not sure why it's cut off there, I'm sorry. So as Guillaume kind of showed this in more detail, but the idea here is it just allows the user to interact with the data to select, do they want to look at a 2040s or 2080s scenario? Do you want to look at a high scenario, low scenario? You can choose the scenario that is important to you. There's that user interaction piece, and also zoom into the areas that you want to see in more detail. We've also been really fortunate in being able to work with a NOAA fellow to take this data and not, the inundation maps work probably for a lot of this audience, and I could use that, but what we found is putting it into these photo points and putting it into the context of what is this inundation, how much inundation is this, can be a really powerful tool. So we had a NOAA fellow, Laura Fleschner, who developed these. It's based, for those of you that know the Canvas methodology, it's based on that, but it's just essentially taking the depth grids and putting them in the context of some known depth visual. So this is an example for the Spencer Bridge under a low scenario and high scenario for 2040. And then what I think is interesting is you can compare this with other areas. So here's the I-5 corridor that many of you are probably familiar as I-5 crosses the floodplain just north of Everett there if you're headed to Mount Vernon or further north. You actually don't see any inundation until you get to the very extreme 2080 high scenario. So then you can start to, really start to help put things in context of where's the biggest risks. And we've found these photos to just be a lot more intuitive and usable for a number of people to sort of wrap their heads around what does this inundation really mean. Here's another example, again, just to emphasize there's no rocket science here. A lot of what we do is just put data sources side by side. So on the left side, the little purple is repetitive loss areas. So what happens when you look at repetitive loss next to areas where they also want to do fish habitat restoration projects? Is there some common ground there where we should be working? So that's what these two maps are showing side by side. The areas in red is another layer to pull in. This is actually areas that local farmers working with the county have said these areas are too wet to farm. So they're low value agriculturally. They can therefore be a great place to do restoration projects on the fish recovery side. So again, just wanted to emphasize it's about catalyzing these conversations between different interest groups. Our tools for Snohomish County are going to be released this fall. They're still in development, so I can't tell you the end point of this is the decisions that we've influenced. So I just wanted to point out this example because it's just really recent that the coastal resilience tool has been developed in a number of different geographies across the country. One of them is in Ventura County, California, and just recently the city of Oxnard, I hope that's how you say it. I don't even know that little town. Maybe some of you do. But they were able, the city council voted unanimously to put a moratorium on all new coastal power plants based on the data that simply showed that these areas would likely be underwater by 2020. So it's a really powerful tool when you can simplify it and look at what's underneath these inundation predictions. So as I said, we're wrapping up our tool with Snohomish County, and Debbie will go into more on where that's going to happen. But there's a few things that I think are important to highlight. And a lot of times we have great data, relatively. I mean, I'm sure some would argue with that, but we have good information on what the climate risk and where the inundation may be or where our fish priorities are, but we often lack that on the agricultural side. And one of the important things for this inundation data in particular that I see is that we're not really quantifying where the areas that have really subsided due to different land cover practices. So that's an issue when you're looking, it's a big issue to consider when you're looking at inundation projects. Our goal, as I mentioned quickly at the beginning, is to sort of incorporate more climate adaptation into the Floodplains by Design projects. This has become a pretty substantial funding for implementing projects. There's $40 million through the state capital funds last year. We're hoping for the same again this year. So that's a lot of funding for project implementation in the floodplains. So incorporating climate adaptation into those projects is a big priority coming forward. And again, it's implementation for projects that integrate the flood control aspects, the climate adaptation and salmon recovery, and other community benefits. So with that, I'm happy to take questions, and Debbie can continue on with Snohomish County specific.
In my work with this is Paul Pickett, I'm with Ecology. In my work with flood-prone areas in other parts of the state, is one of the interesting perception and paradigm issues is that, I guess what I'm zeroing in is the use of the word flood control. Because the paradigm is flood control, or I hear people say, we have to solve the flood problem. And the other paradigm is you have to learn to live with floods, you have to do flood hazard reduction. So I'm wondering, as you work with the local community, if you're running into that paradigm, or, I mean, I just was surprised to see you using the word flood control.
Yeah.
So kind of how do you move that conversation forward?
Slap on the wrist. I try to say flood risk reduction, to be honest. And you're right, I was using flood control a lot. W would maybe be a good one. I haven't heard that with local communities, but flood risk reduction is a better term, and that is what we're doing.
And are the community tuned into that then?
Yes, yes. I mean, I think absolutely most places we work, Inslee said that in his speech, but most places are looking for solutions, looking for ways they know they have flooding problems, yeah. And I just haven't heard the resistance to the term flood control, but I think it's a very good point, and flood risk reduction is better terminology. Thanks. Other questions? It's late in the day.